Let's just kick it off by hearing a bit more from each of you about your background. Tell us about your background, your company, your current approach to entering new markets. So maybe, Matt, we can start with you as a BC-based business that's selling globally. Can you tell us a little bit about Infinity's story?
Sure, yeah. Happy to do so, George, and great to be here today with everyone. So Invinity, we make something called a vanadium flow battery, which is a type of battery that is designed explicitly for storing energy on the electric grid. Energy storage on the grid in general has found a lot of traction over the last 10 years. But as that market is maturing, there's a broader set of capabilities that are needed, especially around very, very high throughput, very long duration storage. Especially as the world is shifting to renewables in terms of the new sources of electric generation on the electric grid. Our technology supports that renewable generation really well, taking wind and solar power and delivering it onto the ground and to all of us as electricity users as needed. We founded the company here in 2013. We merged with a company over in the UK back in 2020. And have been running basically as a global organization ever since then. We do our R&D and manufacturing here in Vancouver, taking advantage of some of the phenomenal scientists and engineers and related capabilities that this ecosystem has to take advantage of. We do manufacturing at 3 main hubs around the world, UK, Canada, and over in China. And we deliver to customers worldwide.
Perfect. Thank you, Matt. Jung, maybe we can come to you next. I think you'll provide a very interesting perspective to the panel because, as I understand, Remitly's core business is internationally first in principle. And beyond that, you have fantastic experience working for global tech companies. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, no, thank you, George, and thank you, BC Tech. I'm really excited. I've actually boomeranged back into Canada after being away for 20 years. And I'm currently the Canada country manager for Remitly. It's a publicly traded fintech company based in Seattle, which is where I recently relocated from. And my role is really leading business strategy, growth, and operations with a focus on international payments, which is the core of what Remitly does today. We have a little over 1 million customers today in Canada. We've been here about a decade, but we only recently opened up our office here in New Westminster about 10 months ago. And we're looking to expand. And one of the reasons why I'm here is really to promote Remitly both as a tech player here in BC, but also we're looking to expand with more engineers, more employees, more partners. And so this is a very timely discussion. As far as international, like George, you mentioned, everything we do is international. It's our approach to new markets is really about local first understanding. So we do take the time to deeply understand the landscape, a lot of the consumer behaviors, the competitive dynamics, before we enter a market. And at Remitly, we're fortunate because we actually get to see the world through the immigrants that we serve here in Canada, which is a really interesting perspective that it's the first for me to actually be interfacing with so many different cultures in one place. And it helps us define things like our pricing, our product, marketing campaigns. Prior to this, though, I think as mentioned, I've had various global product business development roles at large tech companies, both in the US as well as in Singapore. And yeah, I'm really excited to share some of the experiences I've had. I'd say from the startup perspective, I did a quick stint at a venture studio recently where I worked a lot with startups and corporates to help them accelerate AI. And so this, I just have a personal passion for bringing a lot of that support to startups and corporate innovators.
Perfect. Thank you, Jung, and look forward to seeing Remitly continue to grow its footprint here. Michael, maybe over to you. You bring a very different perspective that's very valuable to this conversation. As you're seeing the topics from the big picture at EDC, What do you see in terms of how Canadian companies are approaching taking their technology to a global market?
Great question, and BC Tech, thanks for having me. George, always a pleasure. Thank you for the great question. We're seeing a lot of different things, actually. Companies are trying to dip their toes outside of continental trade. They're following, not necessarily company strategy where they're sticking to, say, areas that are within the digital divide, so to speak, and they're looking at emerging markets within the Indo-Pacific and things like that. A lot of homework has to be done, actually, to Jung's point. A lot of companies think that they can take a shotgun approach and then they're quickly checked once they pass a quarter of trying to press into a new market, what that looks like, and then they have to pivot. And that's where a lot of the conversations come in with me on a risk side. So I think, from a current standpoint, BC has tons of amazing tech companies, and across the pond within the Indo-Pacific is a rich market for a lot of that development outside of the continental trade that takes place within the tech space across all mediums of tech. So it could be film and media, it could be TV and music. It doesn't have to necessarily be just coding, software, hardware outside of the United States. So lots of opportunity and a lot of positivity as the tech space really pivots outside of, I guess, a downturn into new opportunity.
Perfect. Thanks, Michael. No, your comments are actually a perfect segue into the next question I have, and that's choosing which market to enter first can really make or break a company's global growth. Looking back at your own growth journey, what was the decisive moment or key insight that confirmed a market was the right one to enter? And how can other companies recognize that moment for themselves? So maybe, Jung, I'll start with you on this one. What have you seen from your past experiences?
Yeah, no, thanks, George. I was thinking about this one, and it might be a bit of the reverse, because this was actually a moment where I was on the US side and Canada was an international market for us. And it was actually a proud moment because it was leading the launch of Amazon's Alexa. I don't know if you all remember that. It was a couple of years ago. And it was back then, it was still the early days for Alexa. And when we got started, it was really this small internationalization team. And we functioned like a startup. It was just, you had one business person, you had one market or one product. So like it was that essential, two pizza team that they call at Amazon. And we had 10 months to pull it off. And my role was the Canadian business leader. I think they just assigned me because they're like, oh, you're Canadian, you speak the language, you should be able to figure it out. It was a lot of cross-functional partnership that we honed in on three things, though. And the reason why we picked Canada was signals that we saw from customer demand. So we actually started to see Canadians who were buying Echo devices from the US. And so that was some of that organic signal that came through from customers. And they were actually using the device despite not having that Canadian setting. And as you know, with Alexa, there's a lot of like localized services around weather and things like that. And we started getting in like all these customer questions around like, I want to set it to Vancouver or Toronto. And we're like, well, you can't yet because we're not ready. But that was a strong signal for us to start looking into this. And the second was we had this product that, and I know a lot of Canadians don't like to hear it, but like, we're very similar in some ways. We're English-based for the most part, a lot of cultural similarities just being in North America. And our product, and I should say, really, it was the language models, because as a voice-enabled device, we relied heavily on these language models, and they were easily adaptable for the US. And so that was like the second part of it, was there was that product readiness, or at least like getting 90% of the way there. And then lastly, we had the ability to secure some of this immediate distribution. So we had a lot of great Canadian partners, TELUS, TD Bank, Maple Leafs, like they were all part of our AWS ecosystem. So that was, I think, an added advantage, but that just provided the initial intro. Like we still had to go in there and start forging some of these relationships directly on the ground. So I'd say like those three signals across like customers, product, partnerships, like that, those all kind of converged at this time that allowed us to accelerate the timelines, meeting that launch date that we had set. But what also was required, and this was like, I just remember so clearly, like we were flying, and there was only one flight at the time from Seattle to Toronto. I think that's still the case. And just being on the ground, you know, like you're sitting across from some, like I said, some of these great Canadian brands, you know, negotiating, signing agreements. And the hustle was there. Like you definitely had, but you felt the energy on both sides. And, you know, coming in, again, as an American company, it was really important for us to work through these partnerships because we knew we wouldn't be able to achieve this launch on our own. So I guess like, yeah, to sum it up, it was a success because we had all of these three signals converging. And on top of that, having a team that was hustling, very agile, like we were just problem solving on the spot. And it really made that moment happen. And I'd say for everyone else, it's really just knowing, like picking up on these signals and knowing that there's going to be a read coming from the market that will tell you that you're ready to go.
Thank you, Jung. I think I was one of those customers that was giving you the signal to come to Canada. Michael, maybe we can switch over to your perspective then. Like, what research and level setting should founders do before picking a market to enter?
Yeah, great question. I mean, you can over-rotate quite easily in terms of doing too much work and then never actually make it to the market that you're interested in. I often find, you know, from a decisive standpoint as to, you know, determining what the right market to enter is based on your capacity versus your demand. And on a reactive basis, if companies are finding that the demand is outstripping their capacity, then perhaps it's an opportunity for them, even if it's not a market of focus, to further explore that. But they have to be fairly surgical with how they do that exploration, right? SWOT analysis, competition, feasibility, how they negotiate their commercial contracts, how they actually invoice the work. Those are the kinds of key things that are really important. But if you can hammer those pieces in, I mean, there's a lot of countries that look at Canadian goodwill in high regard, especially within the tech space. A lot of innovation here, a lot of proprietary technology, especially if you look along the value streams of captains of industry, right? Ways to improve efficiencies on, say, traditional models of doing work in an industrial landscape. So I think depending on where you're at and what the inflection point is, you know, most people think, oh, the United States, most similar culturally, you know, it's next door. If I need to go there, I can. And then they look to tertiary markets like Singapore or the Indo-Pacific regions or Australia. But if they actually do the work to determine, okay, where are we reactively getting business opportunities and queries? Are we undermining the Canadian goodwill and the Canadian, I guess, proprietary technology that we have and the merit of that? And if the answer is no, we're not undermining it, and yes, we should focus on maybe dipping our toes here, it's then determining, okay, well, what levers can we pull to then really push and test this market? And who is it within the global trade ecosystem or within the subsectors that we work with, or even within the industry associations or companies that are related, how can we leverage them from their experiences to really make a concerted effort into this space to turn the stone over? And then what do we need to do in a contingency if it doesn't work? I think that's the key piece.
Beautiful. No, thanks, Michael. Very, very useful information. Matt, from your perspective, what has unlocked new opportunities for Invinity?
Yeah, look, I mean, when we think about, you know, what markets we want to be going into, there's kind of this trade-off that we make. I know this isn't as relevant in a world where, of course, we're all now driving EVs, but we think about the gas pedal and the brake pedal, right? What's pushing us to want to go into a new region, and what's going to prevent us from doing that successfully? For us, the gas pedal in our industry is always the amount of renewable energy that's being delivered onto the grid, right? Anywhere where we see a huge amount of renewable capacity being built out and a very high proportion of renewable power fueling the grid, those are likely to be very, very good markets for us. And, we've seen, especially markets like the UK and California and Australia, where many days of the year, the vast majority of the electricity that's going on the grid is from those variable renewable sources. Those are going to be great opportunities for us. It's very easy, though, to be sort of wild-eyed and stand around and go, oh my gosh, look, South Australia is an amazing market because they have negative electricity pricing 327 days of the year. The brake pedal is, I think, equally worth our consideration. And, the two questions we really ask ourselves are we really ready to go into this market? Do we have the bandwidth? Do we have the knowledge? Do we have the understanding of whether our product is the right fit? And then second of all, do we have the partnerships that are going to give us that boots on the ground knowledge to be able to actually successfully execute on that market entry and make sure that we're getting good value for the time and energy we're putting into it? And I think I think partnership is something we're going to talk in the subsequent questions. So why don't I leave it there for now?
Perfect. No, thank you, Matt. So, I mean, expanding internationally can obviously surface risks that the companies didn't anticipate. And we see this all the time, from financial and political uncertainty, regulatory hurdles, cultural missteps. From your perspective, what risks do you believe companies most often underestimate when entering a new market? And how can they prepare more effectively to manage those risks? Michael, maybe I'll start with you on this question. Let's start
Sure.
and see what patterns do you see across Canadian companies, and how do you help them prepare for those risks?
Great question. I think, why don't we break it down into different buckets? I think financially speaking, often companies decide they want to go into a new market. Their sales team is in full effect. The board or the decision makers are like, this is an area that we're going to focus in, but they actually don't look at their finances in the same lens in terms of like, how much overhead is this going to cost to actually build the infrastructure to the point where we actually have the ROI, and what is their relationship like with the bank, and how does the bank feel about our jurisdiction of where we're going, understanding how they look at the cash flow of the business to the point where it's at today. I think that's really important, and I think being aligned with a financial institution that understands the vision of the company is paramount when companies want to diversify, particularly out of traditional markets that perhaps the financial institution is comfortable with. So that's something that's often taken for granted, so to speak, where it's like, oh no, I have a great relationship with my bank. I've been with them for 6 years or 8 years or forever. They don't get to decide where the business goes. Well, no, they don't, but they ultimately hold the pen in terms of the non-dilutive capital, depending on when the company needs it. And depending on how the company's cash conversion cycles work, right? I think so that's a really important piece to look at on a home base standpoint. When we look at other risks, it takes time to pivot. Companies, it's like, oh well, we're having challenges in the United States. Well, let's just go to Australia. It's not a switch. I mean, it takes time, and it's sometimes the incubation period is years, right? Because you need to make sure that if you're executing, you're not executing willy-nilly. It's not like a half effort, so to speak, because you have investors and you have results that you need to produce, and you need to make sure that there's ROI from the efforts, and that the intent behind it is to grow the company, right? To scale it. You see that year over year growth, it's 20%. You expect that to scale. You think you're going into a specific market. We didn't plan for there to be a coup in the government there, or for our funds to be frozen and we can't get our money out, or we didn't anticipate such a large FX risk, and we took quite a large loss. So these are the kinds of things that have to be taken into consideration outside of, say, the transactional nature of the specific company or entity that you're dealing with in terms of the transaction and the gross revenue that you're expecting from those efforts. So it's really important to not only pick a market, but then also understand, what is the government like there? How do they view Canadian businesses? What kind of regulatory hurdles do I know of, and which ones do I not know of? And who can I speak to in order to at least feel like I have a much more common understanding of what could happen? What has happened to peers that have went into that space without them anecdotally skewing my opinion of that market? That's also really important. So stay objective, try to keep it less dispositional. And then on the cultural piece, I mean, some companies think, okay, well, I have a really neat proprietary battery. I know that there's market demand in Vietnam, for example. I'm just going to start flooding product into Vietnam, send my sales team there. I'm just using Vietnam facetiously. It's not specific to anything. But for all intents and purposes, companies like to work with who they know. I think sometimes Canadian companies take the merit of their goodwill to at face value, and they're like, well, no, like this is a great product. You don't have anything like it. It's very pragmatic. Where it's like, okay, yeah, it could be from a pragmatic standpoint, absolutely better than anything else that company has seen, but they don't know you. And there needs to be a trust equation that needs to be established and a mutual respect that needs to be established so that there is a reciprocity in terms of what the net benefit is, right? Canadian companies go, they diversify, their concentration risk is broken up, they have a new client, they have a new opportunity to grow their balance sheet. Whereas on the buyer side, it's like, okay, well, we have this great product from Canada or this great service rendered from Canada, but it takes time to get there. And it's a very, as much as the world is your sandbox when it comes to exports, word travels quickly if you don't respect the culture of where you're going and the nuances of it. So if you come in, with a very capitalistic mindset in a market that isn't necessarily capitalistic, and they're much more on, everyone's in for business, but on feelings and emotions, and that word travels quickly in terms of other players where those could be potential customers to you, but perhaps they're looking at you not necessarily with a stigma, but there's a prejudgment against you based on perhaps a different experience that their own peer groups have had. And that needs to be taken into consideration when looking at new markets, and it's often underestimated. I think in order for companies to prepare effectively to manage those risks, they have to first realize that perfection doesn't exist. There's going to be mistakes, and there's going to need to be a requirement for agility, depending on what those mistakes are, but that they'll ultimately be better for it based on what those experiences are. I mean, if they know that there is going to be a Forex risk, or there's going to be different kinds of contracts that need to be structured, they should look at maybe the infrastructural things that need to happen that are not necessarily required for the status quo where they sell. So maybe it's engaging trade lawyers for where they're looking to go, or it's understanding how to perhaps build a layered hedging model because there's no tangible assets and it's really cash flow that will generate their profits, right? Those are the kinds of things that need to be taken into consideration for companies that do well. And also, when they dip their toes into these new markets, as I mentioned, the shotgun approach doesn't work for everyone. It could work for some, depending on what you're selling and what your solution is. But you need to make sure that all of your eggs aren't in one basket. If you're putting 40% of your resources into one new market, you can't abandon the existing market that you have, right? It's much harder to win a new client than it is to keep a client happy, right? And cash flow is king. So if you want to keep pushing into new markets, you need to ensure that you don't forget where you've been. And I'll leave it there. But if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them afterwards, or if there's anything that wasn't necessarily clear.
That's perfect. Thanks, Michael. Matt, over to you.
So look, for us, we sell products that are designed to be installed and operated on the electric grid. The electric grid fundamentally is a very, very, very heavily regulated sector, no matter what country you're going into. So for us, the regulatory drivers are huge. We've announced recently we're developing a new partnership in India for trying to build, to deliver our products there. And we were able to go and secure a meeting with the energy minister in the state, where we are intending to do that first entry into the market. They have a very, very, very different focus about how they want battery assets to operate on their grid as compared with others. What we learned in a 45-minute discussion, and 24 hours of sitting on an airplane, but let's focus on the 45 minutes that was really important, was that they care far less about assets that are going to serve the grid for decades on end, and very much more about assets that are going to be very flexible in how they are able to dispatch onto the grid in the 3 to 5 year time frame. So it just that fundamentally restructures our commercial approach. We can think differently and talk differently about how we're going to go get this work done. But having that policymaker engagement is a great way of massively decreasing the risk of walking into a meeting and proposing something that just in that market doesn't make sense.
Perfect. No, thank you, Matt. Jung, anything to add on these comments as well?
Yeah, I think it's a similar, agility, staying close to the regulators. I've seen some of the biggest risk is really underestimating that gap between regulatory timelines, business timelines. Saw this firsthand in aviation when I was at Wing, or financial services at Visa and Amazon. And it's really important to have that engagement with the regulator, but also understand your business timelines. And there are expectations. I think, Michael, you mentioned like ROI, and there are things that as a business you're going to have to meet, and the balance of aligning like this go to market and then the reality of where regulatory approvals can be often are unpredictable. Like I've seen a lot of situations where they told us yes, and then tomorrow it's maybe, and then 6 months later we're still waiting. And so one approach that I've used in both sectors actually was thinking more about soft launches. So instead of waiting for like this full approval, like really work closely with regulators and partners to see, and internal teams as well, is there a way that you can design this incrementally, do some piloting, demonstrate these things that are the concerns or issue areas for regulators, whether it's safety, compliance, and also showing that there's customer value and customers really do want this. I think all of those things can help push some of those timelines. But yeah, just the key lesson, I guess, is that regulation almost never keeps at the pace of technology. So just making sure that you try to close that gap. Like Matt said, like communicate as often as you can with regulators and just trying to build in some of those interim solutions.
Perfect. No, thank you, Jung. And I won't say to the panelists that I'm insulted that no one mentioned tax. You need to understand the tax landscape when you're going into a foreign country. So I'll just put a plug in for that. So
Yeah,
moving on to
George,
the next.
you totally skipped ahead on my comment on partnerships. We'll get there anyway.
Yeah,
Okay,
especially with
well,
holding taxes and issues like that. Good point.
Exactly.
exactly. So we'll go perfect segue into the next question, partnerships. So partnerships can often unlock market entry and accelerate your growth. What role have partnerships played in your growth, your global growth journey? And what advice would you give on choosing the right partners in a new region? Jung, maybe we'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, great. Thanks. So I think everyone knows the background I have both at Amazon and Visa, where partnerships was core to everything we did to expand globally. Whether it was local banks, merchants, networks, regulators, like we talked about. And, something like digital payments, which is what I'm in now, there's no way to scale that adoption unless you have partners around you and you're part of that ecosystem. And what we found, or at least I found to be successful in all these organizations, was building yourself a coalition so that you start like embedding yourself into the fabric of the market. And whether it was working in North America or Europe or Asia, trying to get at least this cross section of partners that understand your technology, understand what your business goals are, and they could really help you. Like these relationships did more than just accelerate adoption. They also gave us a lot of credibility with customers, helped us with the confidence with regulators, access to distribution channels. So some of these things that these companies have spent years already building, like we almost get, I call it the fire hose or the pipes. You just need to figure out which pipe to plug yourself into. And given that financial services does touch so many parts of the economy, we've been able to work through this wide ecosystem of, and it doesn't all have to be large institutions. We found value in working with small businesses, community partnerships, emerging startups, and everyone brings something different to the table. And so even as startups, like think about how you fit into that coalition or that ecosystem, because there are definitely areas where either big companies or organizations are looking to de-risk some of the things that they need to do to go into a market, or they're looking for ways to accelerate, innovate faster. And these are the gaps that you could start to fill for them. And having a lot of that local knowledge and customer insight also does help. And that's some of the information and data you can get from these partnerships. So I guess if I were to just kind of like sum up that advice, it's really like pick the partners who extend your capabilities, complementary to your services that you're looking for or looking to offer. Look for partners who also bring that trust and legitimacy. So even though, like I mentioned that example with Alexa, even though like Amazon and Google, like they have these great, powerful brands, when you go into some of these markets, they're not actually that big. Like in Asia or actually some European countries, they're very loyal to their brands, the local brands. So just think of how you can create that affinity through partnerships, and also think long term. So some of the best partnerships, it's not about speed. It's really about being around and embedding yourself into that local ecosystem and making sure that you're relevant and that you have a sustainable business that they're willing to invest in.
Perfect. No, thank you, Jung, for that advice. Matt, over to you for your thoughts.
Yeah, look, I mean, I would say that in our business, and I think in general, partnerships are utterly critical to making some of these market entry steps work. I'm going to butcher the actual quote, but the Art of War says something like, know the landscape and know yourself, and victory is assured. You may know yourself. Let's hope you're getting at least close to that, but you absolutely do not know the landscape in some of these countries that you're trying to go into. And it's those partnerships, those people who, you know, eat, live, and breathe everything related to your business in their country on a day-to-day basis that you need to start to absorb information out of. I would say that, you know, from our perspective, maybe this is the engineer in me, but I always like to actually embody these relationships in documents. Like, what are the things that you're trying to construct with your partners in real time? You know, looking at you know, getting some initial thoughts on paper in terms of what are our mutual benefits and goals in making this happen. What are the words that we would assign to the things that we're really trying to get done together? And whether you have to communicate that in a document or in WeChat or in, you know, whoever knows what channel that you and your partner can actually build bandwidth through is super important. I would say, you know, as you evolve that thinking towards what will eventually become, you know, term sheets and contracts and all that kind of stuff, you know, don't ignore the value of those intermediate steps. And yes, make sure that, you know, as soon as you have a term sheet that looks like it's going to say the right things, make sure you give George's team a call to ensure that you're not going to get taxed in some horrific way. But just, you know, don't hesitate to take the time to step through those intermediate stages of formalizing what the agreement ultimately needs to be.
Perfect. No, thank you, Matt. And Michael, I'm curious for your perspective, because this does seem to be a barrier that the audience was saying in terms of international relationships. So maybe you can share a bit about the global trade ecosystem and how companies can tap into resources.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, not to generalize, I think a lot of times companies just look within the private sector in terms of trying to find partners, right? Trying to find proper players. And there's a stigma that, you know, non-private sector players are slow or cumbersome or don't have the same resources. But I mean, I'm sure there is some truth to some of that. I mean, it's not a perfect world, but I do feel that within the provincial and federal landscape, there are entities that are mandated to help mitigate some of these larger challenges, where if they're seen with a myopic lens and perceived as being a company in a vacuum needing to do it by themselves, they'll typically have a less catalyzed success and a much higher burden in order to get there. I think companies also have to realize, like, there's no real quick win. You might get one if you sign a quick deal, but it takes time, and you need to play, you know, it's a very fine line between patience and ROI, to the point Jung was making, right? There are people who are expecting results, but in a lot of the markets of entry that you're looking to go to outside of, you know, continental North America, even if you look along free trade agreements, so you look at Kuzma, you look at what's happening, you know, the opportunities in South Korea or in Europe or Northern Ireland, and just the ease of doing business there from Canada. I think a lot of companies forget to give before they take, and they don't establish roots and build a brand before they try to execute based on their own company merit. And I think that if you actually take the time to know the landscape and leverage players, to your point, George, within the global trade ecosystem. So maybe it's engagement with the Trade Commissioner Service, determine who has boots on the ground, speak with their digital industries person, understand what the regulatory requirements are, VAT, taxes, connect with people like yourself, George, right? So people can have a much more macroscopic view of what it is, as opposed to such a myopic needle point of what they think. Then the perception isn't necessarily reality, right? And you get objectivity behind what you're looking to do. The partners can come in multiple forms. You know, if you're looking to move into a new market, well, then, you know, maybe you're doing a lot of R&D for what that market requires. Well, maybe you leverage, you know, players like Pacifican, right? Or for innovation, things like that. Like it's knowing who's in the sandbox to help you get to where you're going. To Jung's point again, not to keep going to Jung, but like it really takes a village in order to be successful in a market. You can't really do it in a vacuum. And you know, from a non-private standpoint, there are many levels of government that are literally strategically designed to help companies go and succeed globally and provide resources and intelligence that in some cases is free, in some cases it's not relevant, but in some cases it can point you in the direction of where you need to go and reduce that ceiling from 30,000 feet down to 10, which then expedites where you're looking to go. So I think if people keep open minds and they ask the right questions, and if they don't know what questions to ask, they at least align with people who have asked those questions to determine where to go. I think it often bodes well, because exporters do better, truthfully. The bigger your sandbox is, the better companies often do, but there are inherent risks. You have to look at the opportunities from a sales standpoint, but you also have to look at the opportunities from a contingency standpoint. What happens if something goes wrong? Those are the same kinds of discussions you have to have. So there's two sides to the coin when you're looking at picking the partnerships to help with the growth journey.
Perfect. No, thank you, Michael. And just on to the final question that I have before we maybe go to the audience for some questions, if there are any. As BC companies consider the leap into new markets, one of the biggest questions is, are we truly ready? Readiness isn't just about ambition, it's about capacity, resilience, timing. From your perspective, what signals tell you a company is truly ready to expand, and what advice would you give BC companies considering the leap? Maybe Matt, we can start with you on this one.
Yeah, sure. Look, as I was thinking through this, I was thinking about some recent experiences that we had, and I think there's two questions here. There's really an offensive question, is when you're ready, and there's a defensive question, which is, you know, when do you need to go? And I think that the defensive question is just as important as the offensive one. We had a situation recently where we've been looking at expanding into the Chinese market, and we're never going to serve that market ourselves. But there are players who are starting to build comparable classes, comparable technology and very similar technologies in that market. And if we don't go and establish our own or establish our technology as one of the players that is going to help serve that domestic capability, what's going to happen is that we're going to get outbound competition from companies that do end up succeeding in that area. So again, even though we're not the ones who are going to massively dominate that market, if we can give partners the ability to grow within that market, and maybe we get a little bit of license revenue, and maybe we get access to some low-cost supply chain when we were at it, which is great. What we will do is we'll make sure that our broader global platform is continuing to maintain sort of a dominant technical and market advantage.
Perfect. No, thank you. Michael, your perspective on this topic?
Yeah, thank you. It's a tough one. I mean, sometimes companies pivot because they're not having success. And then sometimes companies pivot because they are having success, right? I often find, one of the biggest tellers is year-over-year growth, right? If your AR is outracing your operating capital and you're not necessarily looking to dilute with more equity, and you're not necessarily going through an R&D phase, and you have, a really solid commercialized product that's in demand, that's the opportunity to allocate resources to look at new emerging markets. The kicker is also just making sure that you have the capacity, not necessarily for the market, but for the homework to do for that market. companies expand at different levels. With tech is unique, right? You can have a really proprietary solution, and all of a sudden you have this major hockey stick growth because you're fulfilling a need in the market that wasn't necessarily there. On the other spectrum, you could have a really proprietary technology, but it takes a long time because the regulatory process, and it's a much longer incubation to get where it's in, and the markets are challenging in terms of where that solution is needed. So as long as you have enough runway to cover your burn, or you have access to capital to make sure that as you expand, you're not putting yourself into a major deficit, which then impacts other aspects of the business, I think that's a level of readiness as well. So it's a combination of demand and capacity being equal, and in ensuring that you have enough burn to get where you're looking to go. I look at it like, heading to a different planet. You need enough fuel to make sure you don't get stuck halfway, right? That's how I look at it.
Thank you, Michael. Very smart. You don't want to run out of fuel. Jung, closing comments on this question?
Yeah, I guess I'll write off of Michael's analogy. So I look at it maybe from once you get onto that new planet or new place, like just being ready for what's going to happen, and more from the operator's perspective of being prepared to support customers and partners when things don't go as planned, and really looking at this maybe like even post-launch. And some of the experiences I've had is that it's really, and I think we've all experienced this, it's really hard to regain customer or partner trust once it's lost. And just making sure you're ready to deal with like some of these, or just even being able to anticipate what some of these potential roadblocks or issues could be, and having like a team ready, having systems in place, even perhaps like a way to monitor through like customer feedback, like NPS, or ways to have constant like engagement with your partners to know what are the signals that something's wrong. And so I guess really the advice here is true readiness, maybe like post launch too, where you almost have to like think through some of these worst case scenarios, build up that muscle, have a team. And it doesn't need to be like this massive customer support team. It's just knowing that you have a core team that can help problem solve through these high pressure, intense moments, and be able to have the confidence that you'll be able to get through it. I think that could be a good way to like really stress test if you're ready to go into a market.
Perfect. Thank you, Jung. Erica, do we have any questions from the audience?
I think we have time just to take one. I think the audience is as enthralled as I am with this conversation, but I have one question here that touches on talent when you're putting boots on the ground in a new market. So the question is asking, when you open new offices or build teams abroad, how do you maintain or evolve your company's culture while embracing local ways of working? So maybe Matt, I'll pick you out here first, maybe to comment on here, because I know you've had that experience.
I had that experience, and hilariously spent an hour on this with our team just this morning, because as we're expanding these relationships, this is one of the things that we're really trying to figure out. Look, I would say that when you're a scrappy little startup, everyone gets together in a room one day and everyone sort of like eats and breathes and lives the same way. And those, that sort of tribal knowledge is something that is relatively easily shared. When you're operating across time zones and languages and who knows whatever else, it becomes absolutely impossible to maintain that same kind of internal coherency unless you're really, really, really intentional about it. So, writing down, what, some of the values of the organization are, writing down sort of the ways of working that you would expect your team to actively participate in and actively contribute to the wider group. And then making sure that those kind of cultural assets are not only, codified, but repeated and reinforced to, all of your partners that we're trying to work with all over the world. I think that kind of work is absolutely critical.
Thank you. Jung, did you want to comment on this one?
Yeah, I plus one to a lot of what Matt said around like core values and making sure that permeates throughout, whether it's a global office down to like each of the regional teams. But it's also important to give the regional teams autonomy and ability to work and be agile and on the ground. And so like the two cultures sometimes can clash, where you're trying to, and you know, I'm experiencing this firsthand now too. It's not that we're clashing, it's just everything's so new, right? Like the Canada office is new, you know, all of this, like it's how do you get the global teams to start carving out that market as something distinct and having perhaps like distinct media channels or whatever it might be. But yeah, it takes time, but like having a set of core values that everyone's consistent on is definitely important.
Michael, any commentary? I know you talked about that incubation period earlier. It takes time.
Yeah, I just think, you know, I'll keep it pretty emotive. It really comes down to building community and trust with your peers in any new office, especially if you're a hub and spoke modeling, where, you know, maybe you're in a satellite team and you can feel in a vacuum sometimes. So I think that kind of cohesive transparency and trust is really important to kind of instill. If you look at, you know, what motivates people outside of what motivates people behind the banner of what they're trying to achieve for the company, and understand how people tick, I think that carries a lot of weight in terms of culture, even within a bubble.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Back to you, George. I think you have one last question for our panel.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Erica. Thanks, panelists. So just really final question, final thoughts from everyone. For the startups on the line who are now just starting out but have big ambitions, what words of encouragement or wisdom would you share with them? Michael, maybe I'll start with you just on this final one.
Get connected. Meet as many people as you possibly can. Get involved with associations, speak to peers, have humility with your pitfalls. Make sure people know, obviously without, you know, with reason, right? Where there's an inflection point and what the crux is, to see if you can get guidance on that. Don't be afraid to go to market for a raise. It's not as doom and gloom as people think. Stay in touch with people who probably aren't at your inflection point yet, but who will be resourceful to you on a go-forward basis, and make sure there's a mutual reciprocity in terms of what that relationship looks like. And do your homework. Find out what grants and subsidies are available. Look at other things that aren't necessarily dilutive or non-dilutive as a means to help you get to where you're trying to achieve operationally. So there's tons of resources, and do that with your full heart. Make sure you apply for these things if they're applicable, and that the time makes sense in terms of the return of that time, in terms of what those grant subsidies look like. So I would just preface that and stay positive.
Perfect. No,
yeah.
Thanks, Michael. Jung, any comments on this?
Yeah, definitely on the people side of this, staying close. We talked a lot about partnerships, but just in general, like building trust, showing up in person, I think does matter. And just having a good team to work through some of these problems side by side will be, I think, instrumental to building out your startup. And I'd say, yeah, like focus definitely on building those relationships, because it might be no now, but maybe later. And things are not transactional for sure. And when things get messy or hard, and I think we all know this journey is not linear, it's just, you never know who might come out of the woodwork to help you. So build that trust into your network. And also once you've made it, don't forget to pay it forward.
Very nice. Matt, to round it out.
Yeah, sure. Look, and variations on a theme, but the one that I'd start off with is, you know, what's the expression? Stand on the shoulders of giants. You know, one of the most profoundly impactful relationships we had early on was with a company who had been wildly successful in our space. They didn't sell a lot of batteries to them, but they fundamentally shaped our business, or our vision for how we needed to run our business. If you can get close to those businesses that have been wildly successful in adjacent spaces, and learn not just the marketing bullets, but everything you can about how they were really able to thrive and win, that is just absolute gold dust. And then the second one I'd add is just keep going. You know, entrepreneurship is a long and winding road, and it's hard professionally and it's hard personally. But you know, the fulfillment of breathing new life into a new organization and bringing new technology to the world is just unbelievably compelling. So just keep on keeping on.
Thanks, Matt. And Michael, Matt, Jung, thank you very, very much for your insightful comments.